Today's hearing will examine the widespread and outrageous amount of fraud taking place in and around Minneapolis, Minnesota. Minnesota has lost billions of dollars in state-administered and federally funded programs due to organized fraud. Fraud networks operating in Minnesota dating back more than a decade have submitted over $9 billion, that's a billion with B, in false claims. Some high-profile cases in Minnesota include organizations and programs such as Feeding Our Future, Early Intensive Developmental and Behavioral Intervention, Housing Stabilization Services, and Integrated Community Supports. Now we're going to watch a video.
It's welfare fraud. It's all about the daycare.
They estimate as much as $100 million a year is being stolen by shady daycare center operators.
So how much money are we talking about stolen from the American taxpayer?
Well in excess of $1 billion.
Ripping off state-run programs intended to feed low-income kids, house the disabled, and provide services to autistic children.
Where are the children at? Do you know where the children are at? Where are the children at in these daycare centers?
I don't care.
Are there children here today?
No.
No children?
Yes.
So this is Quality Leering Center. Hello, we'd like to ask where the money's going.
Attorney General Keith Ellison was focused on one thing and one thing only, and that was keeping these folks in business.
When do you think Governor Walz knew about this fraud?
From the very beginning.
What happened here in Minnesota that allowed this fraud to materialize?
The people at the highest levels of responsibility in the government of the state of Minnesota looked the other way.
Fraud within these programs have involved false claims, fictitious providers, and services not rendered, highlighting the need for stronger verification, monitoring, and enforcement to protect taxpayer funds. These fraudulent actions have robbed taxpayer funds intended to feed children, support individuals with autism, provide housing for low-income and disabled Americans, and deliver health care to Medicaid recipients. Since 2021, the DOJ has charged 98 defendants in Minnesota-based fraud cases, 85 of whom are of Somali descent. Of the 98 defendants, 64 have been convicted. DOJ has now undertaken extensive investigative action, which includes issuing over 1,750 subpoenas, executing more than 130 search warrants, and conducting more than 1,000 witness interviews. Since the start of the Trump administration, the federal response to fraud in Minnesota has intensified following a series of high-profile cases involving state-administered, federally funded programs. One of the initial instances of high-profile fraud in the state involved the nonprofit Feeding Our Future, which was at the center of a $250 million COVID-19-related fraud scheme. As part of the scheme, fraudsters exploited Department of Agriculture, USDA food programs designed to provide meals for children. Federal prosecutors ultimately convicted 57 defendants and described the scheme as the nation's largest COVID-era fraud. The issue gained renewed national attention in late December 2025 following a widely shared YouTube video posted by one of our witnesses, Mr. Nick Shirley. Mr. Shirley's work highlighted suspected fraud in Minnesota child care programs. His reporting prompted federal authorities to intensify investigations, expand oversight, and coordinate multi-agency enforcement efforts. A week ago today, Mr. Shirley released a second video that documented alleged fraud in the transportation industry intended to provide rides for children, the disabled, and the elderly. Mr. Shirley uncovered companies with questionable addresses and vehicles intended to transport children, the disabled, and the elderly that remained idle for extended periods of time. We look forward to hearing from Mr. Shirley about what he was able to uncover. But how did we get here? Hopefully another witness, Scott Dexter, a former fraud investigator for the Minnesota Department of Human Services, can shed some light on that for us. And I'd be remiss if I didn't point out that this massive wave of fraudulent activity didn't just have the consequence of ripping off taxpayers. It has drastically impacted legitimate organizations that are truly helping their neighbors. Jennifer Larson is here today to share her story about how this massive fraud has crippled her organization that serves autistic children. We'd like to think that these fraudsters will one day face justice, but it appears that is not always the case. For example, Yasmin Ali, a daycare and home health care owner charged with stealing millions from Minnesota taxpayers, after being granted bail, disappeared before a trial and has not been located since. That was more than a decade ago. The tentacles of this fraud ring are widespread and include crimes other than fraud. For example, the aforementioned Yasmin Ali. Her brother, Adaris Abdullah Ali, pleaded guilty in 2009 to lying to a federal grand jury about his knowledge of a group of young Somali men in Minneapolis who traveled to Somalia to fight with al-Shabaab, a foreign terrorist organization against the transitional federal government of Somalia. We can also consider the fact that at least $700 million in U.S. cash transported via passenger luggage through Minneapolis-St. Paul International Airport. The incidents are all currently under federal investigation, with the majority carried by couriers traveling to Somalia, other African nations, and the Middle East. While no definitive links to funding terrorism have been established yet, we know that hundreds of millions of dollars in cash are being transported to areas where foreign terrorist organizations are active. What could possibly go wrong? A whistleblower has alleged that TSA personnel at MSP, Minneapolis-St. Paul International Airport, repeatedly identified and flagged routine encounters with Somali men carrying large suitcases filled with bundled cash, often exceeding $1 million. During an interview, a former TSA agent at MSP from 2016 to 2021, now a whistleblower, Liz Jackson, noted that she saw, quote, suitcases packed with millions of dollars in cash moving through MSP again and again, carried by the same type of couriers, which raised questions that she feels law enforcement and political leaders still haven't answered, close quote. Jackson further explained her repeated encounters with Somali men carrying suitcases packed with cash, and in one case, a bag filled with new passports. According to Jackson, the volume, consistency, and profile of the transactions she witnessed were well beyond ordinary or everyday behavior. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent has noted that the department is currently investigating where Minnesota's taxpayer dollars are being placed. Additional reports show that Somali individuals in the United States send roughly $215 million abroad each year. On January 9th, Secretary Bessent indicated that the Treasury Department's Financial Crimes Enforcement Network, FinCEN, informed 4 money transfer organizations that they're under investigation for their roles in the fraud scheme involving the theft of funds from social services in Minnesota. He also indicated that some banks in Minnesota are being investigated by the Internal Revenue Service's Civil Enforcement Division for allegations related to money laundering. As you can see, there's much to unpack surrounding these numerous fraud schemes taking place in and around Minneapolis, Minnesota. I would be remiss if I didn't suggest and urge additional investigation throughout this entire country. I know that in my home state of Arizona, our Democrat Attorney General came in to office and quickly said that there had been $2.5 million in fraud just in the Medicaid program alone, and in recent studies released over the last year in Arizona, it's been suggested that as much as $7.2 billion in fraud annually take place in Arizona's similar programs. So this is not just a Minnesota issue, but it just happens to be at the forefront of why we're here today.